Cougar Sports Saturday.
It's complete. Another touchdown!
Cougar Sports Saturday. A presentation of KSL Sports.
Left wing for three. He got it again!
BYU Sports Talk by Cougar fans for Cougar fans. Here are your hosts, Mitch Harper and Matt Baiamonte. On Utah's legacy home of the Cougars. KSL News Radio, 102.7 FM and 1160 AM.
Cougar Sports Saturday, hour number 2 coming your way. We've talked a lot of BYU men's hoops this first hour, and rightfully so. They're playing great basketball, but shocking news, I think, somewhat this morning as BYU announced they were parting ways with their women's basketball coach, Amber Whiting. And to discuss this coaching change, what BYU needs to do to improve and become players in the Big 12 on the women's side of things, we bring in a former player, Jess Chatman, on the program. Jess, thanks for spending some time with us here on Cougar Sports Saturday.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be back.
Yeah, we love having you back, and we love having a former Cougar player to chime in on this. Amber's record was not great during her 3 years. Do you think that was the primary reason that they're making this coaching change?
I mean, I just think there's a lot of change happening in BYU sports that is just not a surprise. Like the record, yes, but even looking at her recruiting, I just don't feel like she pulled a lot of talent into the program in the last 3 years. And so I think it's a combination of a lot of different things going on, but for sure the record did not help.
What did you see as some of the on-court issues for Amber Whiting's teams over the past couple of years?
I just feel like their offense is a bit chaotic. I don't know. I just feel like there's not a ton of rhythm to it. And I feel like it's kind of just all over the place. And I just feel like that was part of the problem of why they didn't win a lot of games down the stretch, especially because that really does come down to coaching when it's like a neck and neck game.
It's interesting you mentioned the talent piece because I think some people would look at it and say Shaylee Gonzalez was there at the beginning of the tenure. No, she wasn't actually. She left the year before.
Yeah.
But you bring in Delaney Gibb, who's been great this year.
Amari Whiting was top 50.
Amari Whiting, who is in the transfer portal now, but and then you had Lauren Gustin in there too. So when you say there wasn't a lot of, do you just mean not enough supporting talent?
I mean, if you think about it, so she brings in her daughter, that's an automatic. I don't think that obviously became because she was her mother, but she didn't, I don't think that's a big, huge pull in my opinion. She got Lauren Gustin from the previous coaching staff. And then I do think Gibb was an amazing grab, but it's one big grab in 3 years. I just don't think that's enough talent coming, competing in the Big 12, in my opinion.
Talk with Jess Chatman here on Cougar Sports Saturday, BYU Let's Go of Amber Whiting after 3 seasons. So what type of coach should BYU look at next? What are some of the qualities, Jess, that you feel BYU should be looking for in this next head coach to lead the women's basketball program?
That's a good question because I think that it's an exciting time for BYU sports that they can go 2 directions, right? So the previous direction they went was with a high school coach that didn't have a ton of game experience in terms of Division I. And so if they were to go that route again, I do think there's some candidates out there, but I think that they just need to get a coach that has a lot of experience as a head coach at the D1 level. Maybe not even as a head coach, because I know we might bring an assistant maybe up or something like that. But I just think they need someone with experience, especially competing in the Big 12. We just can't have, not as much experience in that. So I just feel like they need to bring someone in with a lot of experience.
Would you prefer they bring in someone new that doesn't have any association, or do you think they should look at, because there's really 3 in-state candidates that would and could make a lot of sense. Lee Camard, a current assistant who's the interim head coach down the street at Utah Valley. Coach Nelson, he was an assistant under. Did you play under Coach Nielsen?
Yeah, he was on the staff when I was at BYU. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then there's Morgan Bailey up at Utah. What do you make of those candidates? Is that something that you think BYU should entertain?
I mean, I think that Lee Camard's been a part of 2 staffs there, right? And I personally wouldn't hire in-house. With Dan, he hasn't had the greatest record either at UVU, so I worry there in terms of the experience factor of it. I think Morgan Bailey would be a really good coach. She obviously has experience. She's an alumni, and then she just went over to Utah, and they've been doing really well over there. I think she has a ton of experience. I think she'd be a great candidate for the job.
One of the big things that I wonder, too, with BYU women's basketball is what can they do to get one more support? Because I feel like that's always been an X factor for BYU men's basketball and BYU football is that, yes, there's some challenges because I think any job at BYU is going to have some red tape and some challenges that are unique to BYU, but they always have that foundation of fan support. What do you think can be done to generate more fan support that makes this job really, very attractive to overcome some of the red tape that this next head coach will have to navigate at BYU?
Yeah, I think a lot of the excitement around the men's program is due to the recruits they're bringing in, right? Like they're getting these top recruits and they're putting a lot of resources into that. I think the fan support would come from also bringing in some big recruits. Like I think it obviously comes down to the talent that we're bringing into the program. So if we're bringing in these like bigger, like 5-star, 4-star, whatever that looks like, I think that would for sure bring a lot more excitement to the program, get some fans in there. Because then they're good. They're bringing in these recruits, right?
What is a reasonable expectation for this next coach? Like, I think obviously you want all your sports to be championship level, and maybe that's the expectation, but what bar does this next coach have to meet for BYU fans and people just looking inside the program to say it's trending in the right direction?
I think they need to be top half of the Big 12. I think that they have the resources to do that. And so I don't think it's an excuse to not be in the top half of the Big 12, number one. But number two, I think that they need to also make some March Madness appearances. Like first round, great. But like, I just feel like they have the resources. They obviously could bring in talent to be able to do those things. And I just think that the women's programs the last couple of years hasn't gotten to that expectation in its time, in my opinion.
I'm really curious to see too if the revenue sharing era that's about to take place in college sports with all the sports getting a cut of money. You have to think that BYU being a power conference and the Big 12 wanting to compete at the highest levels and pay these athletes, you have to wonder if maybe that can help bring in those high profile recruits that then gives BYU a better chance to get to those March Madness appearances and start winning big because it feels like the potential's there.
For sure. And like, we aren't low on resources, obviously. Like we're bringing in, the men's program, talks of 5 to 7 for AJ. And like, even Igor this year was $1 million. So it's like, we have the resources. I think it's just the choice to invest in the women's program. And if we want to see change, it's like, we do need to invest in, invest in the women's program.
Jess Chatman's our guest for a few more moments here, breaking down the change that is brewing down in Provo with the women's basketball team. Amari Whiting, the daughter of Amber Whiting, is in the transfer portal. How difficult do you think that situation was, just navigating a mother-daughter situation in the locker room?
Yeah, I am not a big fan of mother-daughter type of connections on the team. I think it's really hard as a player to have a daughter on the team just because it changes everything. It changes the conversations you have amongst each other. It changes the locker room. It changes just the camaraderie. Like it's hard. And even like with playing time, it's like she started every single game as a freshman, as a sophomore. Like it's hard not to show favoritism to your daughter, obviously. It's just also really hard to be on a team with a daughter. And so I personally would have had a really hard time on that roster. I'm not going to lie.
How involved do you think players should be in a coaching change? I'm looking at this from the perspective of Delaney Gibb, who was just spectacular, and you'd want to retain her. How much do you think a player of her caliber should be clued in to voice her opinions on who could be the next head coach?
To be honest, I don't really think it comes down to the player's decision. I don't think that's a player decision to have. Like, I think obviously like they can bring in some candidates and see like how they vibe with the players, but I think that comes down to the administration. Like that's the AD's decision to make, not the players. And I mean, I think Gibb could even be one of those players that goes into the transfer portal as well. She had a phenomenal year. And if she doesn't like who they bring in, I mean, she could end up in the portal as well. So I don't think it really is a player's decision. I think that's on the admin.
You bring up the admin, and it comes at an interesting time with,
Right.
Tom Homo announcing his retirement. And I think that's kind of one of the areas where I think some, including myself, thought maybe there's a chance Whiting holds on for one more year because of the uncertainty at the AD spot and who that next AD is going to be. But do you think this timing is right to do this now and to turn the page and bring in a new head coach?
Yeah, I think it's a fresh start. I mean, I think that her job could have been, on the chopping block when the new AD came in anyways. Like, I think that,
Sure.
She had a lot of things going for her in that regard. So I'm not surprised that they let her go with Homo right now, but I think it's a good fresh start so that he can put someone in there. He obviously has the experience to choose someone that he thinks is best for the program. I think it's the last-ditch effort to kind of save this program.
She is Jess Chatman. Jess, thanks for the time. I'm sure we'll have you back on once a new head coach is in place and we can react to that decision.
Thanks, Jess.
Sounds good. Thank you. Have a good one.
All right, Jess Chatman breaking down the news of the women's basketball program, and it is an interesting time. And I think one thing that is encouraging if you are a fan of the women's program is that one thing is clear: winning is expected at every sport right now. Because
no question.
If 3 years and no progress, is this a move they make after 3 years in a different time at BYU? Maybe not. Maybe they let it ride a little bit more, but you can't be one and done in Big 12 tournaments and not showing improvement. So it's not just football and basketball. I think this move makes it clear across the athletic department we expect to compete. And if we're not competing, then we're going to find someone who can help us get there.
And I think fans listening love that. And I think Shane Reese has set that tone and that expectation where BYU wants to compete at the highest levels. And I did think that with the AD uncertainty, it felt like there maybe could have been a chance for her to get another year. But that on-court product has struggled. BYU could have won more games in the Big 12 this year, the BYU women's team. They could have beat West Virginia on the road. They had 31 turnovers, though. This team always committed turnovers, time and time again. It was self-inflicted wounds. Against UCF earlier this week in the Big 12 tournament, they had an early first-quarter lead, took care of the basketball. Second quarter, 8 turnovers, only 7 points. Then they buried themselves, put themselves in a hole. They also lack size in the front court. The guard play has been good for BYU women's basketball. The efficiency, though, was an issue for BYU in some players. But it's got to get better. And I think, too, that I really wonder, though, what they're going to be able to do to really get BYU fans bought into women's basketball. And this is where, look, there's no method. This is just kind of like what I've seen over the years with BYU sports. One of the things that does sometimes hurt the women's sports at BYU, like a basketball, is that women's basketball tends to be played on Sundays. So they can get their own day around the country where the men play on the Saturdays, women play on the Sundays. If you're a BYU fan and you've got some money, whatever it is, or you're spending time watching TV, which game are you going to watch? The BYU men or the women? You're going to pick the men, probably, because that's just what you've done. So there's never been this opportunity to really kind of game after game after game watch the women's team and invest and commit. But there's that opportunity because you're seeing more exposure. Every game's pretty much on ESPN+. You can watch any game. You can watch this team. But it's still like that. There's a unique challenge to that where I feel like the fan base has never taken off because you see it with women's soccer. That's a really good fan base. Women's volleyball. They don't compete really with football very often. Sometimes they have some Saturday games, sure. But I just think women's basketball, for whatever reason, has never taken off at BYU. And it's not because they haven't been good. They've had more Sweet 16s on the women's side than the men. They've had 3 Sweet 16s in my lifetime. The women's program has. The men have had 1 in my lifetime. Now, I know they had 81 with the Elite 8 for the men, but you can win at BYU. And the Big 12 women's side is not the gauntlet like you see in some of the other leagues in women's basketball, like the Big 10. It's not that. TCU was down and out a couple years ago. They won the league. It can be done. How can you go make a splash, commit the resources, and get this thing to a higher level? I just think you got to have a system in place behind the scenes, a day in, day out commitment to something greater than yourself, kind of like what we're seeing with the men's side, and a system that there's belief in that's proven to work. And that's going to be the challenge for Holmo and this administration to find the next head coach, because the last one was a high school head coach. That was one of the most shocking hires I've ever seen for BYU sports hiring. And it didn't work out in 3 years. Now they got to get that right and get this thing back on track.
Let's get to some candidates for this women's job on the other side. Stay with us. A lot more reaction to this news, and, of course, previewing a big rivalry game on the men's side later tonight here on Cougar Sports Saturday. Let's get to the candidates, Mitch, for this women's job. We touched on a few. So there's Dan Nielsen, the Utah Valley head coach. He was an assistant under Jeff Judkins. He's been at Utah Valley for several years now, and I have been a bit surprised that the Wolverines women's team hasn't been better in the Western Athletic Conference. So I think that would probably be a knock on Dan, is that you went down a level in competition and the success didn't follow. Because as an assistant under Jeff, they were much more successful than he has done as a head coach. There's Lee Camard, which is an interesting one.
He's the interim coach now.
And you'd have to look. I haven't seen the finalist list, but you'd have to imagine that he was a finalist for the job.
And you have to think too that this move comes at a time where you have an AD in place who has publicly gone on the record and said he always has a succession board ready to go. If you hired someone new, would that person have the board to go find an LDS women's coach? Because I'm telling you, it's very hard. Like, the last coach you go to was a Burley High School head coach in Idaho. So that kind of told you the pool was a little bit thin. And Holmo, to his credit, he's acknowledged he always keeps a potential succession board or the replacement board on deck for every sport, because that's why they never hire a search firm. Typically, schools are going for turnkey ZRG. Hey, let's get a search firm launched and then help us drill down and find some candidates. BYU does not do that. They don't operate in that world, and they don't go to the search firm business because they're not going to third parties. They're doing it in-house because, again, it's a unique job. And I think that's one of the things that's interesting about this, to do it now with Holmo there, because he's got a track record with hirings, and Santiago's going to be involved. He oversees this program too. He's heavily involved with the basketball programs too. So I think that's kind of an interesting dynamic that you have to factor in. I was kind of brainstorming some potential candidates. I did come across the UVU Dan Nielsen. A coach that is interesting out in D3. Again, D3. I'm trying to turn over every stone here, Matt. Southern Virginia, who's got connections to the church. They believe in the LDS church beliefs. Lynette Schrader, she's a successful coach in women's basketball.
This is the same university where Joe Dupay, a former BYU football coach, is he the head man there?
I believe so. I don't know if he's still the head man there, but yes, he was.
Billy
there.
Nixon went there too.
Yes,
right?
That's right. But she's a successful women's basketball coach there. Also, John Wardenberg's son is a women's basketball associate head coach at Air Force, Adam Wardenberg. Oh, yeah, Joe DePay, still Southern Virginia head football coach. There you go. Adam Wardenberg, too. And then there's got to be some wild cards out there. I mean, there's got to be people that are LDS that are in the coaching game, but I guess the question's got to be, Matt, is there a Kevin Young in women's basketball in the WNBA? Or here's a thought, too. When you talk about Kevin Young, remember Jeff Judkins, he coached with BYU men, and that was different because he was in-house with the BYU at the time with the men's side. But do you maybe target a men's coach that's been a long-time assistant? Say, hey, get a head coach opportunity, come here, LDS, give you an opportunity to succeed. At the women's game, I don't know. Like, it's a very tricky position because, and is this the job too that maybe you consider the Diljit Taylor route, where you hire a coach who's not LDS? I don't know. It's a difficult job.
I'm very open to that.
I think he'd have to be, to me.
I love your Southern Virginia poll, though, too. I think I'm not an expert, of course, on women's sports.
Yeah.
I will say I've done play-by-play for women's sports for almost half my life. I did play-by-play for women's basketball for Utah Valley for many, many, many years. And I still do play-by-play for women's volleyball for Utah Valley. So I've been around the women's sport for a long time. Again, I'm not an expert, but I think the reason I like your pull of that candidate from Southern Virginia for two reasons. I do like it when the women's sports have a woman head coach. I think there's some value there. It's not that a man can't connect to a woman player from a coach-player dynamic. Of course they can. We've seen it many times at BYU and at much higher levels. But I do think there's just a different dynamic there in a positive way.
Yeah.
And then I like that she's successful. I like the wins. I think I'm worried about coaches that haven't been successful as a head coach previously. And I'm also worried about coaches that don't have head coach experience. This has now become a big job. This isn't a WCC job anymore.
And this is a job that if it's similar to other Big 12 institutions, again, BYU is never going to go on the record about this, but if it's similar structure in terms of pay structure in the revenue sharing era, women's basketball makes a nice cut. So the women that are on this team next year in the revenue sharing era, the 15 roster spots that they have, they will make money and they will get paid. And they will make a lot more than WCC players and Group of 5 athletes. They will make a nice chunk of change.
They're in that tier 2. They're not Big 10 and SEC, but that next ACC, Big 12, they're right there.
And who knows, again, BYU has not gone on the record and said they're paying the $20.5 million in revenue sharing. But if they did, and the Big 12 Commissioner Brett Yormark has said he wants his institutions to compete at the highest level in revenue sharing, if they do go to that, it's nice money to be had for whoever is on that team next year. It's a big job. So you wonder, too, if you can find a coach that's got great recruiting background. But I think one of the things that stood out to me in the Amber Whiting era was that it felt at times the operation itself felt a little bit high school-like. I'm watching a game, covering a game, and I'm seeing a player, I've never seen this before, eating chips during the starting lineup introductions. There was a player on the court eating chips. It's just things like that. Look, that sounds very Look, did that define a wins and loss? The girl wasn't playing. She was injured, whatnot. But it's just things like that. That was very weird to me. I've never seen that. Imagine Kevin Young's starting the lineup. Yegor David! Some guys just in the handshake, eating Fritos. What? It's just weird. Talent's there. Delaney Gibbs, awesome. Amari Whiting, room to grow, but talent was there. The operation just
I don't know
felt
if the depth was there, though.
Right. And they had a lot of injuries, and there were a lot of factors. They've had some misses and some players that they've counted on in the past. There was a big Jenna Solomon who didn't matriculate in, Jenna Sai. There were some players that they were banking on they were going to be big, and that didn't work out. And so it hasn't always been the most fortunate circumstance from the personnel standpoint for Amber Whiting. Ariel Mackey-Williams, back-to-back years she missed. There were players that they were counting on, they weren't there. And it's tough. And that's why I kind of felt like maybe you give her one more go, one more chance to get it right. But, clean slate now for the next AD, and you move forward into a new era with women's basketball. We got to take a break, though. On the other side, we'll get to the top 5. And then more Cougar Sports Saturday next here on KSL.